Andrew Holecek, welcome to the Seekers Forum. It's great to finally meet you after all these years.
Likewise, Mark, it's my delight, really a pleasure to meet you, and I look forward to spending some time with you here.
Thank you. I want to talk to you about the interface of science and spirituality, which is obviously a huge topic. But you came to a point in your own life where you were at this precipice between the two. After you had been a seeker for a while, then you were studying physics, I believe. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And
yep.
then you came to a point where you said, quote, "I didn't know it at the time, but I was looking for reality. I thought physics described reality and that all my answers could be found there, but physics describes physical reality. It does not describe a more complete spiritual reality." Can you describe that conundrum where many of us actually find ourselves? In the science of being in the culture of religion, the culture of science rather, but hungry for what it can't describe.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so the scientific journey and the spiritual journey have been very near and dear to my heart for, I hate to confess how many decades at this point, right? And so, like you said, I was very deeply involved in the science business years and years ago, still in my teens, actually. I had some powerful, I guess you could call them metanoias, breakthrough experiences, which interestingly enough, Mark, they were, when I had this first somewhat major insight and my mind kind of blew open, it's a very interesting experience because when I had the opening per se, it was completely non-conceptual, ineffable kind of opening, awakening, dare I say. But then the Rolodex of my history and my conceptual mind started pinging in, like, what is this? Like, what's happening here? And a particular obscure law, the conservation of angular momentum of all things, right, popped into my head. And I said, oh my gosh, maybe physics is some way that I can substantiate, mature, develop this particular insight. And so I came out here at the University of Colorado. I studied physics, thinking that really physics could answer my question, and really came up against the dark night of the soul because I realized I was barking up the wrong tree, so to speak. And since, that was a bit of a crisis of faith in, you could say, the cult of scientific materialism. And we can come back to this. I think it's actually a misnomer to even call it scientific materialism because it's not scientific. Materialism is a belief system. We can get back to that. But I realized at that point, this is not what I'm looking for. I was looking for retrospectively reality. I didn't know it at the time. I thought physics describes it. And again, we can come back to how much like quantum theory, quantum mechanics has to say, neuroscience. There's a tremendous field of contribution there. But they're not really talking about the same things. And I've since come to understand that physics and the sciences don't really describe what reality is. They describe what reality does. And that's a colossal difference. And so I don't think you'll ever get to the big fancy word is the epistemic basis, or what they call the ontological primitive, the reduction base. You're not going to get to it, in my estimation, through the scientific method. You can get it through empirical methods, and that's where the confluence is, because both, like for instance, as you know, I'm a deep student of the Buddhist tradition. And one reason I like that tradition so much is it's highly empirical. We can't say it's scientific anymore. My dear friend Evan Thompson, in his book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist, I think very cogently argues why you can't really say that Buddhism is a science, even a science of mind. I actually agree with his arguments. But that's not to say that we can't use some of the tremendous insights that the Western scientific community has to say. But long response to a really great opening question. That's kind of how I got to this point.
Right. And so how did Buddhism help to bridge the gap between science and spirituality for you?
Well, I mean, I guess it's a matter of dancing once again between the empirical basis between the two. That's the thing that bridges it for me. And on one level, you could say that things like physics and neuroscience describe reality, quote unquote, from the outside in. Buddhism describes it from the inside out. And I think there is an interface where they have some kissing points. In fact, I would say the arena that really they talk, where the confluence is the greatest, in my estimation, is in neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, and the psychological arenas. And so, yeah, I'm not sure where else to run with that one, Mark. It was just that I noticed when I dove very deeply into the the Buddhist hypothesis. Here's these particular states of mind. In fact, my favorite definition of Buddhism altogether these days is it's a description of reality. I'm not saying it's the description, but it's a description of reality. And so they both, the scientific community and the Buddhist communities, I think both have a very legitimate trajectory vector of trying to determine truth, trying to determine what's real. But their fundamental suppositions are different. And I think that's where there's a lot of what I call category errors. There's a lot of places, just because you're using the same term, a multivalent term, doesn't mean the signifier is the same as the signified. Just because you're using the same word, like all the confusion that you'll see in the Tao of Physics or the Dancing Wu Li Masters, there's some errors there because just because particular discipline is using the same word as another discipline doesn't mean they're talking about the same thing. And so I think that's where people run into trouble. But I'm not sure that's an entirely satisfactory answer. But
that's quite so. What are the different suppositions, if you had to generalize? What are for the layman to look at the suppositions of the scientific method versus the suppositions of the spiritual path?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I mean, I would say the suppositions and the main kind of aspirations of I can speak with a little bit more authority about the Buddhist approach, is fundamentally like what the Buddha arguably allegedly said: I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the end of suffering. So it has a soteriological premise. I mean, that's really what it's all about. It's transcendental pragmatism, right? It's about looking at the nature of things. And this is where it is somewhat scientific, in that what the Buddha did, and this is actually important to throw in just briefly, the Buddha really didn't, often it's misattributed that mindfulness and everything started with the Buddha. It did not. The Buddha inherited those methods from the developing Brahmanical tradition. What Buddhism introduced, what the Buddha really discovered, was Vipassana, insight meditation. And so that's a highly analytic, inquiring type of approach. In fact, Vipassana in Pali, Vipassana in Sanskrit, this is another one of these multivalent terms that means a number of different things. But one definition is really this process of inquiry, the process of analytic investigation. And this is empirical. And so in that regard, that's one major point. So really what the Buddha did, what led to his awakening, was he looked at the very end, this thing called death, and in a very sophisticated, really elegant process, stepped his way back. Sometimes I call it a 12-step detox process, returned to the fundamental premise, the parameters of what it is that causes death. And so he took the same inquiring lens and brought it to everything. Question authority. I mean, the bumper sticker question authority relates to the Buddha. And he would definitely say that questions are more important than answers. And in so many ways, that really defines the tradition. So that's a monumental difference between the two. The Buddhist trajectory is soteriological. It's about salvation. It's about the achievement of liberation. The scientific one, I mean, I love to hear what you have to say, but it's largely about understanding the workings of reality. It depends, of course, on the scientist that you're talking about and who is actually engaged in this. So I think there the vectors are almost individual from scientist to scientist. But I would very much like to put the ball back in your court and see what you think about that. I mean, what do you see as the difference between the Buddhist tradition and the scientific approach?
I see one as deductive and one as more inductive, in the sense that it's bringing something invisible into awareness. So the spiritual path for me we're not looking for empirical proof. We're looking for a knowing that's larger than empirical knowing.
Nice.
So to me, that's inductive, whereas science to me is all about reducing the whole to the parts in order to separate them and understand them. And as you said at the beginning, see how they work.
Yeah, that's really real well said, and I would agree. And I think it's also one of the strengths and limitations of the scientific method is, in fact, it's reductionism approach, right? So they want to fundamentally reduce, take everything, cut it apart, literally atom, that which cannot be cut, reduce to the fundamental inherent basis of reality. And so in that regard, yes, that reductionism is healthy, but it's also the peril behind that is, again, what is the reduction base? In the scientific community, the reduction base is matter and its transformation is energy. And so right off the bat there's a supposition that there is such a thing called matter. And the Buddhists would say that that's right there where the line has to be drawn. Because Buddhism is fundamentally, it isn't talked about this way, but if you really look at it closely, it's a form of idealism. It's a form of absolute idealism, which means what? The world isn't made of matter, the world is made of mind, heart, spirit, whatever you want to pen that label to. So right off the bat, right there, you have a colossally different reduction base. The epistemic primacy, I love these big words, the epistemic primacy, the reduction base is different. And so when you're trying to reduce everything to matter, which is something the Buddhists would say, well, that's never going to work. That's where you get this ridiculous hard problem. You'll never solve the hard problem of consciousness. For your listeners, you know what that is. How does consciousness, mind arise from, as my friend Ken Wilber beautifully says, how does it arise from frisky dirt, right? Well, it doesn't. And so therefore, the hard problem is a problem that has at its basis a fundamental error. And so right off the bat, that's a really big difference. On one, the Buddhist approach, and it's not only Buddhism, it's the non-dual traditions, non-dual Shaiva Tantra, Advaita Vedanta, these other traditions. They will tell you, and you can figure this out for yourself using these methodologies, the experimentation, quote unquote, of the meditative tools. So you see this for yourself. You can come to determine what the great wisdom masters have said, that reduce everything in this healthy sense, from the Buddhist perspective, reduce everything not to matter, but to mind. And then when you do that, of course, that reductionism automatically, like a Mobius slip, transforms into a full-blown holism, where you realize that the great inseparability, the oneness, the unity. And so, yeah, something like that. But I think that's a really important and foundational difference between the two. Yeah, one, at the ground of one is mind, heart, spirit, whatever you want to call it. There are many names for that, which is fundamentally ineffable. But the scientific reductionism in the Western sense is trying to reduce everything to atoms, either matter or energy. So that fundamentally is a big difference.
So, and that goes back to what you were saying about that there's nothing scientific about materialism. Materialism is a
belief system.
A system. It's a belief system.
And let me say something very briefly about this, Mark, because this is important. This whole notion of objectivity, this whole notion of the nobility of the scientific method in that regard. I would argue that there is a deep underlying psychological imperative behind the scientific method to reduce something into its fundamental irreducible building block. And one very interesting thing to talk about here is that if you can somehow substantiate that there is something out there, and you have to give the physicists some credit, because even John Wheeler, student of Einstein, beautifully said there is no out there. So there's some really interesting things we can talk to about that. But fundamentally, I look at it, one reason physicists in particular, are so insatiably driven to locate some fundamental atomic whatever, is because by immediate implication, if you can find something out there, that implies there has to be something in here. Self and other co-emerge. And so I would argue that the so-called objective longing to find the irreducible component of reality out there is actually driven by a psychological quest to substantiate the fallacious sense of self in here. And so this leads down a different topic where I think a lot of what scientists do, and of course they would contest this, is really driven by 95% of what we do in our conscious lives, which is unconscious processes, right? The neuroscientists have told us that. I mean, think about that fact. 95% of what we do is driven by unconscious processes. And so I think a lot of what scientists do are driven by these processes unbeknownst to them, and therefore booby traps they fall into.
So let me ask you a devil's advocate question for someone who is completely immersed in materialism.
You or me?
Neither, I hope. But when you say that matter doesn't exist, can you break
Yeah,
that down a little for
yeah.
people for whom that is a completely alien
It's
subject?
well, thank you for catching me on that, because that's an outrageous statement. I mean, how can you assert that matter doesn't exist, and then by implication that there isn't something out there, some solid, lasting, independent thing out there? Well, parenthetically, all you have to do is, and I'll give you my own personal riff on this. All you have to do is look a little bit more deeply into the unbelievable implications of the most successful theory in all of history of science, which is quantum mechanics. I mean, quantum mechanics has some astoundingly profound things to say, which is why so many of the great physicists turned somewhat mystical because of their science. I mean, they were discovering aspects of reality that were like, hey, wait a second, this does not fit into Newton's world. This does not fit into my normal world. But fundamentally, the quantum theorists have a tremendous amount to say about the participatory nature of reality, that there isn't nothing solid, lasting, independent out there. We enact, in the terms of the great neuroscientist Francesco Varela, we bring forth, we co-create, not in a solipsistic New Age way, but we collectively and individually enact. We bring forth this world, just like in a dream, parenthetically. And therefore, many scientists will tell you this is a participatory universe. But here's the contemplation I want to leave with you and your listeners that might require a little reflection. And this is really incredibly important, supported by amazing statements. One physicist that comes to mind is Andre Linde from Stanford University, where he says in tremendous elegance that, paraphrasing him, the only thing, and again, like a good scientist, see if this is true, kick the tires, check it out against your own experience. The only thing we ever have is experience. Hard stop, exclamation point. That's it. Everything else is inference. It's all we have. We only have experience. And so to infer that there's something beyond experience is in fact just that. It's an inference. It's a supposition. So one way you can look about what matter is, and again, I say, just look at yourself. But could it be possible that matter is simply the label we append to the regularity of experience? Matter is the label we append to the regularity of experience. Now, that doesn't mean on a relative level, and this is really important. When you enter the domain of the spiritual business, you have to centrifuge out absolute and relative truth. When we're talking about the real nature of reality, the true nature of reality deals with absolute levels, what's called non-duality, what that really means, and we can talk a little bit about that. Scientists fundamentally work within the domain of relative truth. And so we cannot in any way dismiss the incredible prowess, the success of the scientific method and its application in technology. And I think this is one reason why the scientific approach has gained so much traction, because of the power and the efficacy of a technology. But fundamentally, it deals with relative truth that doesn't deal with these absolute dimensions of truth. And so when we're talking about matter on a relative level, we can't deny that there is the appearance of this thing that we impute to be solid, lasting, independent, called matter. We're not the wisdom traditions are not really challenging that. You know, what they're doing is they're challenging the authority of appearance. So one way to talk about this, Mark, is there's a difference between appearance and reality. And that when there's that dissonance, when there's that rub, that is in fact what we call, the wisdom traditions call samsara, the world of conditioned suffering. Appearance is not in harmony with reality. That's why we suffer. So therefore, discovering what is real, the primary favorite definition of Buddhism for me, similar to what scientists do at the level of relative truth, that they have a lot of great things to say. But matter only really exists, or I should say, appears at the level of relative truth, as in fact does space, as in fact does time, as in fact does causality. Space, time, causality, the very things we take to be axioms, givens, the very context of reality, these are all constructs. Even Einstein said this. Look at the work of Nima Arkani Hamed. Go online and listen to his amazing talk, Space-Time is Doomed. So space, time, causality are all constructs. Matter is a construct. The sense of self is a construct. It's something made. It's made up. And therefore, what the spiritual path can do at relative levels is, if it's something constructed, we can deconstruct it. So I'll pause there to see if that's landing with you, but I think this is really worth a deep reflection. And look at your own experience. The only thing you ever have is experience. That's it. Anything beyond that is an inference. And so if you're inferring something like matter beyond experience, that's a construct. That's something that's not in resonance with reality. Find out if it's true for yourself.
Well, it is true. I mean, this is something I'm a student of non-duality. This is something that's familiar and very dear to me. What I'd like to do is kind of drill down a little bit on people's individual practice.
Okay.
I don't find that folks tend to apply an empirical or a reasoned approach to their spiritual practice enough. And that we just allow that to be in the kind of nebulous woo-woo realm without really testing our beliefs against our experience.
Beautiful.
Can you say something about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, a couple of things come to mind. One is allegedly the very last things the Buddha said before he died, something to the effect of, I have given you everything. Do not take my teachings at face value. Test my teachings against your experience. Work out your own salvation with diligence. So on that level, that's pretty empirical kind of thing, right? And so I'm wondering, Mark, I'm trying to suss out here a potential like an anti-intellectual sentiment that you find in the spiritual community, a lack of looking. See, this is
the head is demonized, the heart is lionized. People forget that the heart is the seat of the mind, as they say in the Talmud, that this duality is an invention of our Western philosophy, and that in fact reason is a heart-based practice.
Well, I would say, there's a lot there, my friend. Holy moly. I would say something a little bit more compelling in my estimation, and that is that duality is a developmental issue. That it's not a fabrication of the Western mind. It's just been perhaps most articulated. In fact, my dear friend David Lloyd beautifully says, and I completely agree, that Western philosophy largely came about as a way to solve the problems of duality. I think that's true. Solve the problem of duality, you have no need for philosophy. I think that's really true. But I would say that the dualistic approach is actually a developmental issue, because it's based on the necessity of being able to separate self from other. If we didn't have that on a conventional level, we wouldn't have an immune system. We wouldn't have the antigen-antibody complex. We would not be able to survive in the world. So to provisionally be able to separate out self and other, this is a critical part of evolution altogether. We can't really throw that away. So I look at the dualistic view as a development issue based on ego, because that to me is what ego is. It's an arrested form of development that basically where it reifies, solidifies this sense of self and others. So that's my argumentation for looking at things in a so-called dualistic way. But this anti-intellectual sentiment, this is really interesting, because to me, it's a little bit of the pendulum swinging a little bit too much in the other direction. And so you could say on one level, the materialistic view, it really is a form of fundamentalism. It really is a form of extremism. We're extremists. If you think matter exists, if you think there's a world out there, you're an extremist, whether you know it or not. And so what tends to happen in my experience, my teacher, Palimpa Rinpoche, talks about this beautifully. He uses the phrase, the extreme path to the middle. And by this, what he means is because we're so far to the, I don't want to get political here, but to the right, let's say, you can almost say to the right, right? You're so far to the right, you're so far into the materialistic thing that initially there's so much cutting, negating, the via negativa, the apophatic way, negate, cut. So then you shred, you bring the pendulum swings too much in the other way. And so then you get, you're cutting the beauty of the intellect, you're cutting the beauty of the incisive rational mind, which absolutely has a place. And then you're throwing all your eggs in the kind of intuitive basket, in the heart basket. And so what my teacher Palimpa Rinpoche says is originally that may be of some provisional validity, but then you don't want to become a fundamentalist or extremist in that end. So you want to find your way in the middle. the middle way, as we often talk about. So the path is really one of, using Hegelian term, to transcend but include, that we can transcend this fallacious, wrong relationship we have to the external world, seeing it as made of matter, seeing it made dualistically. We can transcend it as the view gets better, we grow up, but we include it. Just like when you transcend the ego, you include the ego. So it's like when you go from age 15 to age 16, you don't kill age 15, you transcend but include it. And so therefore, when you grow up beyond this mechanistic, materialistic, dualistic view, you always have recourse to look at this particular way relating to reality as a skillful means to help others. It's like when you're working with a child. You're not going to talk to them from an adult perspective. You're going to stoop down, meet them at eye level, speak to them in a vocabulary with which they speak, which they can relate to. So I know I'm throwing a lot of noodles on the wall, but I think these are important ones. Ego and duality is the developmental issue. Yeah. The process is maturation is transcend but include. Yes, it's helpful to swing everything initially into the kind of intuitive heart basket, but then fundamentally it's the harmony, the non-duality of the intellect and the intuition, of the heart and the head, so that they're both, in service and dancing with each other, and one not in opposition to the other. They're both just part of this wonderful, messy, beautiful, complex thing we call the human condition, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Beautiful. In a piece that you wrote called The Pitfalls of the Mindfulness Revolution, I'd like to talk about the 3 pitfalls that you point out, which seem to go to the heart of a lot of what we're saying. So you mentioned scientism, you mentioned meditative bypassing, and you mentioned McMindfulness.
Right.
Could you tell us what you mean, first of all, by scientism here?
Yeah, that's a really important point. So scientism is when one takes the nobility of science and turns it into this ignoble monster, where fundamentally, and there are different forms of scientism, but the kind of strong version of scientism is that if science cannot substantiate the veracity of a particular claim, that claim can be dismissed. And this is one of the challenges between the marriage, which sometimes is a shotgun marriage between science and spirituality and science and meditation. I mean, I roll on this community. I've been in these fMRIs. I've done these studies where, I mean, there's like over 1,000 studies a year now, Mark. That's a lot. 1,000 studies a year coming out about this whole meditation thing. And there's promise and peril to that. One great promise of that, I know I'm circumambulating your question, is that the paradigms, the fundamental cultural container of the West, in my estimation, is psychology and science. And so having the support, having I mean, if we could say it carefully, the allegiance, the backing of the scientific community with some of these meditative claims is actually quite helpful. But on a very real level, these wisdom traditions don't need science or even psychology. Buddhism doesn't need therapy, double entendre intended. It's fine by itself. But because these are principal cultural containers of the Western world, one of the great successes of Buddhism as it flows from country to country is it adapts to the cultural container into which it flows. And so the scientific container is an important one in that regard. And so I'm sorry, I lost track. Oh, so yeah, scientism, mindfulness, that's right. And so the real danger is if we somehow think that unless science can substantiate the claims of the meditative traditions, that somehow these claims are fallacious is really completely wrong. It's like St. Bonaventure talked about, the 3 eyes, right? The eye of reason, the eye of contemplation, and what's the third one? The eye of the flesh, the eye of reason, and the eye of contemplation. So the eye of the flesh is mostly what science works with, conjoined a little bit with the eye of reason, rationality. The contemplative traditions fundamentally almost playfully work with the third eye, which is the eye of contemplation. And so one has to be very careful not to acquiesce to the alleged supremacy of the high priests of the cult of scientific materialism. Strongly stated, but I think you get the idea.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of mindfulness and things like that, the mindfulness revolution is a colossal contribution to the West. It's really, it's doing tremendous good. But meditation, in particular, mindfulness meditation, it's entry level. It has a particular bandwidth of applicability. Mindfulness sedates. It does not liberate. Or Tsogkyi Rinpoche, a great master, talks about it this way. Mindfulness is like taking a weed whacker and getting rid of the weeds. Insight meditation, deeper meditation, is pulling out the roots, getting to the root of the problem. And so with the world that's on fire, almost literally, chilling out is a really good thing to do. Meditation, mindfulness meditation, I bow to it. Tremendous power. But I'm actually writing a book right now, the title of which is, Okay, I'm Mindful. Now what? Now what? Exploring the wonders of the natural mind. Because the idea, again, is to use the great power of chilling out, settling the mind, pacifying. The word you know in Sanskrit is shamatha, settling the mind. It's a little bit like, here's the way I look at it using a scientific analogy, Mark. It's a little bit like the Hubble, or in this case, the Webb telescope. When you're working with mindfulness, it's like taking that mirror that constitutes the incredible reflective surface, especially these days on the web, creating a mind, in this case, that's so polished, it's so smooth, it's so clear, that when the light comes in, that's the vipassana, the reflection, the insight meditations, then you can see things you've never seen before. So mindfulness is incredibly important as a method, as a tool, but the McMindfulness thing is using it to become mindful, to become a more aggressive corporate executive, or to be better in the military, or whatever. Mindfulness was not designed for this. Mindfulness was designed, again, as a tool for soteriology, for spiritual advancement. It's not designed for these sorts of things. So the McMindfulness thing is co-opting that, perverting it, and using it in all these deleterious ways that I see happening in the West. But there was another part of that question.
What about meditative bypassing?
Oh, yeah, that's another one. This is a little bit of a riff on terms originally coined by Trungpa Rinpoche called spiritual materialism, then taken up by one of his foremost students, John Wellwood, in his really fine contribution with his teachings on spiritual bypassing. And this is really important. And I see this a lot in my own experience. I see it in the communities that I roll in, that what very often can happen is that if you become a little bit too extremist with a meditative, spiritual, contemplative approach, you can, it's actually a type of reductionism. We use that term in a pejorative sense earlier in a scientific way. There's also kind of a spiritual reductionism that can take place in the negative sense, where you can try to reduce everything into these fundamental spiritual things. And therefore, my meditation will solve everything.
Right.
I don't think so.
No.
Get back to me on that. And this is the great contribution of the integral schools, the work of Ken Wilber and others, integral theories, where we find that the place of meditation, we hold it in that place. We realize its strengths and limitations, and we open ourselves to other vectors of development. So I see both meditative and spiritual bypassing. They're epidemic, where people, they swing their pendulum too far in the other direction. Oh, I'm just going to go off into retreat. And here's an extreme example of this. In fact, my friend Ken Wilber did share the story with me, where this person will not be named, but apparently a relatively advanced teacher of the Buddhist tradition said, I guess one level you could say, thank you for being honest. I'm not really that terribly concerned about global warming and what's happening in the world today. I'm going to go to a Pure Land when I die, right?
Oh,
and so that's an extreme version of that, right? I'm just going to, my meditation will solve everything. I can throw everything into that basket. And my response to that is, get back to me in 10 years and let me know how that works. Right.
It's like the rapture. It's like waiting for the rapture. We don't have to worry about anything. We're going to be beamed up, in some way.
Yeah. And that's why, and this is really important. One last thing, Mark, and I'll bring it back to you, but this is really important in the Hindu traditions, can really help us here, this notion of Turiya versus Turiyatita, right? So on one level, what they call Turiya means the fourth. You could say, for purposes of time, that it's that which is beyond materialism, beyond matter. It's the kind of the fourth state that most people would deem to be the spiritual state. And a colossal problem with that is that if you think that's it, then what do you do with matter? What do you do with relative truth? What do you do with appearance? What do you do with all the forms that you were retreating from when you did your meditation retreats? And so the really deep authentic paths go from Turiya to Turiyatita. That means beyond the fourth. It doesn't mean it's a fifth. What it means is you take the insights from your spiritual practice, you take the insights from your meditation, and then you bring them back into the world of form. You bring them back to a more heightened relationship to your thoughts, to your emotions, to your upheavals, to the world of matter, to the world of appearance. And then it's my languaging here, borrowed from Samuel Bonder, where you wake down. It's not just about waking up. If you just continue to wake up, that's a form of escapism. I just want to FedEx my consciousness out of here when things get tricky, right? No. An authentic practitioner will do a U-turn, again, double entendre intended, Y-O-U turn, bring their spirituality back into the world of matter as a gesture of compassion, wisdom, to be of benefit to others. This is really important because, again, we're slapping, dashing a scientific thing. Hey, we got to be careful, we spiritual practitioners, of our own blind spots. What are we not saying? Where are we getting stuck?
Yes.
Like mindfulness is where we get stuck. Meditative spiritual bypassing is where we get stuck. These escapist trajectories is where we get stuck. So if your spirituality isn't bolted into the world, in fact, my thing right now, Mark, is if what people are doing with their psycho-spiritual development, if it can't be applied to bring benefit to the world today, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. Take what you're doing. If you can't bring it into the world that is on fire right now and really live your spirituality, you're in a spiritual bypass vector. So be very careful about that.
Yeah, that's really well said. Before we close, I need to ask you, because my audience won't forgive me if I don't ask you something about lucid dreaming.
Oh, that's my real thing. Yeah,
that is what you're best known for. It's fascinating to me. You seem, between your studies of lucid dreaming and death and dying, you're interested in those bardo places, those in-between states. I've seen you described as an elite lucid dreamer. So can you tell me what that means? How did you become such? And just give us some sense of why lucid dreaming is exciting and potentially helpful for people on the spiritual path.
Oh, what a great, there's a, now you've hit my sweet spot. Well, right off the bat, dream to me, the word dream is a multivalent term. And to me, dream literally means manifestation of mind. That's the way I relate to dream, manifestation of mind. And so if you go back to what I said 20 minutes ago, that if you take, again, just a look for yourself, find out, test these truths, kick the tires, find out for yourself, take a very close look at the nature of reality. And I promise you, but you have to do this to really test it, you will discover that reality is of the nature of mind. And so if dream is code language for manifestation of mind, what does that imply? That implies exactly what the Buddha, the awakened one, the ultimate lucid dreamer, discovered. This is a dream. And I mean it, this is a manifestation of mind. And so for me, Mark, what the great gift, genius of lucid dreaming, and in particular dream yoga, which transcends what includes lucid dreaming, is where you use lucidity or awakening in the dream state. So a lucid dream for people who may not be familiar with it, is a metacognitive dream. It's a state when you're dreaming, normal nighttime dream. Something clues you into the fact that you're dreaming. You wake up. You're completely awake, but you're still dreaming. That's the beauty of a lucid dream. Dream yoga takes that wonderful distilled state of consciousness and uses it as a kind of laboratory of the mind to explore the nature of mind and reality. And so the Buddhists have a very interesting way of talking about this. They talk about the nighttime dream, very interesting term, as the double delusion, or the example dream. Well, that's interesting. What does that imply? Well, it means this is the primary delusion. This is the real dream. And so what one does with lucid dreaming and dream yoga is one studies the mind in this wonderful, distilled, refined, liquid environment, which according to the wisdom traditions, by the way, if you are lucid to it, you are more in contact with the nature of reality in the dream state than in the waking state. And even deeper, as your hero and my hero, Ramana Maharshi, said, even in deep dreamless state, that which does not exist in deep dreamless sleep is not real. So if you're lucid in the dream state and you're lucid in the deep dreamless state, and scientists are working on that one now, you are actually the most in contact with reality in those dimensions. And so what one does with lucid dreaming, dream yoga, one studies the mind using the laboratory of the dream arena as a way in a bidirectional manner to gain insights, to bring the lucidity of your nighttime dream into this dream. So lucid dreaming leads to lucid living. It helps you wake up to the fact that this is a dream. And this is where I usually lose people. They go, what? This is a dream? Yes, this is a dream. So one last thing you mentioned, Bardo Yoga, the great gift of lucid dreaming, dream yoga, it's not merely bidirectional, it's tridirectional. And by that, what I mean is that when you work with the nocturnal mind in the dream state, not only do those insights ping back in, I playfully talk about it as opening interstate commerce between two previously disparate states of consciousness, right? Waking state and the dream state. You traffic insights back and forth between the two, so they bootstrap, they cross-pollinate. But then the great gift, especially from the Tibetan approach, is not only do these insights from the lucid dream ping back to wake you up to this, they ping forward, if you believe in this sort of thing, to help you wake up in what they literally call, it's a very interesting term, the dream at the end of time, which is where the Buddhists and other wisdom traditions assert that's where you're going to go when you die. And so this answers so many very interesting things. One is the perennial question, like, well, where do you go when you die? Well, within this particular framework, you're simply transitioning from one dream to the next, from one manifestation of mind to the next. And so when we go back to this very first thing that we talked about, this all weaves together. Take a very close look at your experience. You will discover that that's all there is. There's only mind. There's only experience, just like in a dream. So if you really want to explore this, work with your dreams. There's nothing outside the dream. There's no dream wall beyond the dream. There's just the mind manifesting in a completely idealistic way in the dream arena. Take those insights, bring them back into this collective dream, challenge, question authority, see if it's not in fact true. And for many people, this is a highly disconcerting discovery because it literally pulls out the rug from their conventional reality. Matter is pulled out from underneath your feet. The world of physicalism is pulled out from under your feet, that which ego takes its ultimate refuge in. And I would argue this is precisely why underneath it all, at the center of our relative self-sense, is this quite pronounced fear of this truth, that we don't really want to see that the world is of the nature of mind, that the world really is a dream. So anyway, something like that. This is a colossal topic.
It's a huge topic. Let me just ask you one personal question. Are you able to lucid dream deliberately?
Pretty much it will. Yeah, again, it's a practice, right? I've been doing this for, decades, right? Certain people have certain, I guess, talents, just like, some people are predisposed to be good at the piano or the violin. Certain people are predisposed to be good dreamers. I've always had a gifted dream life. And then when I discovered these incredible skill sets, liminal dreaming, just briefly, 5 types of nocturnal meditations: liminal dreaming, lucid dreaming, dream yoga, sleep yoga, Bardo yoga, a really rich night school. I've been doing this for decades, and just like anything else, the more you do it, the better you get at it. And so lucidity for me is a fairly common affair. Working with liminal spaces and all that is very common fare. But the most important thing for me now, Mark, this is really my path these days, is stabilizing the realization, literally, that this is a dream. That to me is the kicker. And then when I have those openings, those moments of lucidity during the day, then everything that I've said in the last hour or whatever that may seem like metaphysical mumbo jumbo or rhetoric, it just becomes your very direct experience, what's literally called yogic direct valid cognition. You literally see for yourself that this is in fact the nature of mind and reality. So there you have it, my friend.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's just been fantastic talking to you. I want to learn more about lucid dreaming, and I want to encourage everyone to get Andrew's books and take his workshops, because he is the man when it comes to lucid dreaming. So thank you very, very much. Take good care of yourself. I hope I see you again.
Wonderful to make contact with you. Thanks for the great questions and the opportunity to chat. All the best.
Thank you, Andrew. Bye-bye.